Thank you so much for allowing me to be with you today at the SEC conference by Zoom in this format. I'm grateful for your flexibility and for the invitation to join you in exploring the relationship between orality and literacy in early Christianity. My focus today is a comparison of two texts, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 32 to 33, and the book of Acts chapter 9, verses 23 to 25. I would like to begin by reading those two texts. They're both short, so that we have the substance of the text in front of our minds. So in 2 Corinthians 11, Paul relates the following incident from his life. In Damascus, the ethnarch or governor under King Aretas was guarding the city of the Damascenes in order to arrest me. But I was let down in a basket through a window in the city wall, and I escaped from his hands. That's Paul's colorful account of his flight from Damascus. Now, in Acts chapter 9, we find a similar account. In fact, a remarkable parallel. Acts 9, verses 23 to 25 says, after some time had passed, the Jews plotted to kill him, that is Paul, but their plot became known to Saul. They were watching the gates day and night so that they might kill him. But his disciples took him by night and let him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a basket. Now, the extent of the agreement between these two texts is significant, in fact, remarkable. It consists not only in the general course of events, but it extends to the wording, which is partly identical and partly synonymous. The correspondence appears more extraordinary in light of the fact that the book of Acts otherwise exhibits no verbal connections with the letters of Paul. Whatever the origin of the parallel may be, the existence of this text in Acts suggests that the incident of Paul's flight from Damascus left a deep trace in the memory of the early Christ followers. It is a memory, by the way, which time has not erased. Friends of mine, colleagues who have visited Damascus, tell me that the Damascenes still point to an opening in the wall through which the apostle was let down. Now, I would like then to explore in some detail the relationship between these two narratives. As it turns out, the narrative recounted in Acts chapter 9 contributes nothing to our historical knowledge of Paul's flight from Damascus, despite its similarity to 2 Corinthians 11. The disappointment in this case may be felt more keenly because of the existence of features that are peculiar to the narrative in Acts, uh, in the context of what is common to both narratives. And those distinctive features awaken in us the hope of additional information on the circumstances of Paul's flight. Instead, the version of Acts is, in many respects, more detailed and colorful than 2 Corinthians. Luke reports that the Jews were watching the gates and that the watch extended over several days. Luke says in Greek, hemeras te kai nuktos, day and night, and that Paul's disciples took the initiative in arranging Paul's escape, so that his flight took place under cover of night. Now, all of those details are unique to the account in Acts. Paul himself allows that he was threatened with arrest, but it is only Luke who says that Paul was in danger of death. In only one respect does the account in 2 Corinthians exhibit the character of a personal experience to a notably greater degree than the story in Acts, and that is in Paul's mention at the very end of his success in flight. Paul says, I escaped, I fled from his hands. And so we are tempted to approach the account in the book of Acts with the expectation that what we will find here is a tradition that will, or that could supplement 2 Corinthians chapter 11. But that is when we are disappointed, because we discover upon closer examination that what is peculiar to the account in Acts must be attributed to Luke, that is, to the Lucan redactor of this narrative, whereas what is shared with 2 Corinthians appears, I will argue, to derive from a piece of Pauline tradition whose basis is nothing other than 2 Corinthians 11, 32 to 33. So let's go back and look now in greater detail. The beginning of the account in Acts differs entirely from 2 Corinthians in form as well as in content. The danger in which Paul finds himself comes not from the ethnarch or governor under King Aretas, but rather from members of the Jewish community. Saul's powerful preaching in the synagogues of Damascus has driven the Jews to plot his assassination, but their plot becomes known to Saul. So the portrayal of the Jews as the persecutors of Paul is undoubtedly and demonstrably the work of Luke, the redactor. Throughout the book of Acts, the Jews are presented as the implacable enemies of the Jesus movement. They have killed Jesus, and now they seek to kill the apostles and evangelists. That the attempt of the Damascene Jews to do away with Paul is redactional in origin is demonstrated by the presence of a term in Acts chapter 9, which is thoroughly characteristic of Luke's vocabulary. And it is the Greek verb anelein, anelein, to do away with, to destroy, to kill. That verb is used repeatedly in the Gospel of Luke and in the book of Acts to describe the murderous intent of the Jews upon Jesus and his followers. In fact, the word is used twice in this little passage of Acts in verse 23, and then it is used in the following pericope in Acts chapter 9, verse 29, to describe the attack of the Jerusalem Hellenists. Indeed, the vocabulary of Acts chapter 9, verses 23 to 24, is entirely Lucan. All of the major terms, plerun, hikanos, epiboule, and this suggests to me and to other scholars that the redactor, Luke, has composed the passage with a relatively free hand. The account in Acts converges with 2 Corinthians only at the end of Acts chapter 9, verse 24, where the author says that the gates were being guarded. That Luke is working with a piece of tradition here is evident from the concreteness and the brevity of what is recounted. And in both of those respects, Luke's account rivals 2 Corinthians 11, 32 to 33. The transition to the tradition that Luke is conveying is signaled, clearly marked, by the intensive chi in chapter 9, verse 24b, a vestige which makes visible the literary seam between the tradition and the text, and it permits, I think, a justified inference about what has preceded. It is clear that something has been omitted by Luke. From the report of the devising of a plot, the text then moves directly to the observation that the Jews were watching the gates for Paul. They were doing that also. Now, what is presupposed here, but not explicitly stated, is that the Jews had been searching for Paul elsewhere in the city, but they had been unable to discover his whereabouts. So they set a watch upon the gates. Now, at points, the vocabulary in Acts is identical with Paul. The little Greek phrase, diatouteus, through the wall, and so forth. The participle, kalasantes, being let down. And Luke's pleonastic use of the latter seems especially significant. Other features of Luke's account are homologous or synonymous with what is found in 2 Corinthians. Luke uses the word spuris for basket rather than Paul's sargane. But the two terms are variants describing the same object, a basket in which Paul was let down. So, to summarize, it seems clear that there is a connection of some sort between the two passages. But the account of Acts cannot be derived from 2 Corinthians directly or in its entirety. And I would like to suggest, relevant to the theme of our conference, that the best explanation of the evidence is that Acts chapter 9, verses 24 through 25, incorporates a piece of oral tradition based upon 2 Corinthians 11, 32 to 33. In other words, we have here the phenomenon of secondary orality. In the communities where Paul's epistles were disseminated and read, a secondary oral tradition developed that had Pauline biography as its principal subject. And an anecdote like Paul's flight from Damascus would have been often told and readily remembered. In this form, I would argue, in the form of a secondary oral tradition, the episode became known to Luke a generation later. But comparison of the text reveals that the roots of this colorful, often told tale lie in 2 Corinthians 11, 32 to 33. Several features of the account in Acts, such as kaitas poulos, even the gates, and hemeras te kai nuktos, day and night, are best understood as the products of an oral tradition, which has a tendency toward amplification. Other characteristics of the narrative, such as the phrase labontes dehoi mathetai autou, and the word spouris, so his disciples taking him, and the Greek word spouris, basket, may derive from Luke in his role as a skilled editor, redactor. So, in light of the secondary oral tradition, which connects Acts 9 and 2 Corinthians 11, and the resulting correspondences in detail, it is important to recognize how different the overall portraits of Paul which emerge from the two passages. Luke presents Paul's escape from Damascus as an act of divine deliverance, which triumphantly thwarts the plot of the Jews. In 2 Corinthians, by contrast, Paul recounts his flight from Damascus as the final example of the dangers and hardships to which he has been exposed as the servant of Christ. In the book of Acts, the rescue of the preacher by those whom he once persecuted deprives the Jews of their only means of retaliation against someone who has confounded them in debate. 2 Corinthians, however, makes no mention of Jewish adversaries. The danger to Paul comes entirely from the governor under Aretas the king. In Acts, the account of Paul's mission to Damascus fulfills the word of the Lord given to Ananias, namely, that Paul would be God's chosen vessel to preach Jesus to the sons of Israel, and that God will show how much Paul will have to suffer for Jesus' name. Now, in the book of Acts, this is a drama that is repeated in the life of Paul, first there in Damascus and elsewhere, as Paul moves from city to city, persecuted by the Jews. In 2 Corinthians, by contrast, Paul's flight from Damascus under humiliating circumstances, hiding in a basket, is offered by Paul as an example of the weakness of which he dares to boast. So, far from providing a supplement to 2 Corinthians 11, the account in Acts 9 has the effect of obscuring the circumstances, the historical reality of Paul's flight from Damascus by tempting scholars to make harmonizations, facile harmonizations. Now, given the history of the tradition embodied in Acts 9, that the fact that it's based upon secondary orality, it is naturally possible. In fact, it is tempting to combine the details of the two narratives. So, the Jews are described as the instigators of the attack upon Paul by a number of commentators. They were the ones who fomented, who induced the ethnarch of Aretas. They created social unrest. You would be surprised how many commentators harmonized the two texts. Through this opening in the wall that represents the Jews as the instigators, a swarm of anti-Jewish fantasies have found their way into commentaries and historical discussions of the early life of Paul. So some scholars say that the Jews bribed the ethnarch of Aretas with money. That suggestion, I'm sorry to say, is actually made by the great Theodor Zahn, and it is repeated by the German scholar Riesner. The Jews bribed the ethnarch with money. The ethnarch was intimidated, commentators say, by the size and power of the Jewish community in Damascus. That suggestion is made by no less a scholar than Martin Hingel, one of my former teachers, in his book on Acts and the history of earliest Christianity. And then some scholars say that, or they picture in their reconstructions the Jews standing along with the soldiers of the governor of Aretas, standing in the gates, ready to point the finger at their kinsmen. That suggestion is made by, once again, Theodore Zahn and Alfred Plummer in his commentary on 2 Corinthians. And as if this were not enough, a little bit of psychologizing supplies the Jews with motives. Commentators say they were bewildered and disappointed at the apostasy of their fellow kinsmen. And so they persecuted Paul because they were so disappointed. Again, Martin Hingel says that. Now, for all of this, friends and colleagues, there is no support in 2 Corinthians. The suggestion that Paul might have omitted the part played by the Jews in this persecution because he wished to spare his countrymen and women embarrassment, that suggestion is contradicted by Paul's description of repeated flogging at the hand of the Jews in 2 Corinthians 11:24. Whether Luke remained ignorant of the attack upon Paul by the ethnarch of Aretas, or whether Luke deliberately suppressed that information in keeping with his tendency to portray the Jews as the persecutors of the Jesus movement, that cannot be easily determined. But it is clear that the temptation of scholars to harmonize the two narratives in such a way that it makes the Jews responsible for the attempt upon Paul's life, that is methodologically problematic and should be given up. So I hope I have contributed something today to our investigation of the relationship between orality and literacy by proposing that the account of Paul's flight from Damascus in the book of Acts is the product of secondary orality. In the communities where Paul's letters were preserved and read, colorful biographical episodes like this one gave rise to an oral tradition that continued after Paul had put his stylus to the papyrus. And that's, I think, the best hypothesis to explain the relationship between these two texts. I wish I could be present with you in Sydney to answer questions and to engage in discussion about my hypothesis and its implications. You are always welcome to correspond with me. My email address is the same as it has been for many years, Wellborn, my last name, at Fordham, FORDHAM.edu. Let me close then with a little joke, a witticism. When my colleagues who visited Damascus were shown by tour guides the window in the wall through which Paul was let down, one of my colleagues, a professor from Harvard, pointed out that that was unlikely because the wall was medieval. It was only built in the Middle Ages, to which the unflappable tour guide responded, medieval wall, but first century window. Thank you all very much for giving me the opportunity to share my work with you today, and I look forward to more dialogue and discussion in the future. Thank you.